Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along and welcome to tonight's event on what happened at the COP and what does it mean for the world. My name is Tony Curran. I'm a part of the University of Southampton's Public Engagement with Research Unit. And we have a great panel of speakers from the university joining us tonight. I'll introduce them all in turn very shortly. For now, I just wanted to move on the presentation slides I'm sharing with you during the evening, just to say that this is part of the Southampton Arts and Humanities Festival, which began today and runs through to the 20th of November. And there is a whole programme of events happening as part of that festival. So do check out the programme and get involved in some of the other opportunities over the next week or so. So what I wanted to do is welcome you to the event and then get straight into it, really. So we've got 4 different speakers joining us, and I wanted to introduce the first of those, who is Dr. What I wanted to say at the beginning, just to paraphrase the event that you're all expecting tonight. Obviously, you know, it's part of COP26's festival and conference that the UK has been hosting over the last week or so, which is seeking to catalyse momentum to tackle climate change. And the question we'll be kind of answering over the course of the hour is, have we seen meaningful renewed commitments to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement? Or has it just been more blah, 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 as Greta Thunberg said? We will come back to Greta's provocations a little bit later. But first, I'm going to bring in the first of our speakers, who is Dr. Wassim Dbouk. Wassim is a PhD student. He completed his PhD at the University of Southampton in Marine Environmental Law, and he's now a Marine and Maritime Policy Research Fellow. We're delighted that Wassim is joining us live from COP26 to give us some of his perspectives. So Wassim, welcome. And what I'm going to do as Wassim introduces and makes some opening remarks is I'm going to flash up some photos that he sent of his experiences over his time at the COP. So Wassim, over to you with a generic question. What's it been like there?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tony. And good evening to everyone joining us. Good evening from Glasgow. It's a great honor, and I feel very lucky to be here, to be joining you. And it's been truly a wonderful experience with mixed feelings, I must say. So far, mixed feelings because I can see from one end, you can see the level of ambition and excitement from everyone around what needs to be done, and which is encouraging in itself. But at the same time, especially in the past day and today as well, I mean, yesterday and today, you can start to feel the level of panics rising and the levels of frustration because of the lack of big news, big announcements that are being made. But at the same time, you can see a lot of efforts that's being done from different players, states in their own countries and non-state actors, but also from industry and people actually really trying to work together. So it's been great, but we're still waiting to see what really comes out of this conference.
Yeah, exactly. And right into a follow-up question, Wassim. You're there as part of the University of Southampton's delegation. Can you explain for those watching why universities attend the COP and what you and other academics do there?
Absolutely. First of all, this is a great opportunity, first of all, to engage with other academics from other institutions around the world, and we've had the opportunity to do that. And I'm here with a delegation from the University of Southampton. Part of the delegation came from the first week, and I joined for the second week with a number of people here. And everybody comes with their own sets of expertise and knowledge, and that allows them to engage with people in similar areas where they can bring their knowledge together and work together to provide solutions for the climate crisis that we're facing. But at the same time, it's a great opportunity to meet with policy stakeholders and the various governments coming from various perspectives. And that's one of the really interesting things that caught my attention here. I've heard about the different perspectives and needs of various states, and I've read about it a lot, but it's a different experience to live it here to have these the individual chats with with people coming from different perspectives and different needs, and wanting to achieve with having different agendas. So this is a great opportunity for us as a university to engage with those actors and to help fill fill knowledge gaps that would inform their policies and help implement their policies that they already have in place. So and at the same time, it is a great chance to engage with non-state actors and business industry actors, for example. So it's really, there's a lot of opportunity that's available for academics and research institutions in a conference like this.
Yes, I agree, exactly. And okay, so your role at the university also covers enhancing the policy impact of the university's research. Can you give us an example or two to illustrate what that means?
Absolutely, absolutely. And as you can see from the pictures that you're currently sharing, I tried to reflect these different perspectives. In my time here this week, I've had the chance to have chats with policy stakeholders for example, in the very exposed, least resilient states, like small island states. For example, I met the second day I got here, I met with the British Virgin Islands Minister for the Environment, where we've discussed how, through working with the Southampton Marine and Maritime Institute, we could help fill some of the knowledge gaps that they have, and to protect them, to protect the populations there, especially around climate change, and also achieve all their wider policy, their wider sustainability agenda. But at the same time, I've had the chance to speak to policy stakeholders who come from developing states, or in states that have much more capacity, if you want. So and to see what sort of where do they get their knowledge from? What sort of needs do they have to implement the policies that they already have in place and they have the capacity to implement? So I've had conversations with at the pavilion zone right behind me, actually, from delegates coming from, for example, the UAE or Saudi Arabia, and the Nordic countries, for example. These countries that have advanced, I mean, their strategies are relative, I mean, to various degrees advanced compared to other nations, but they still require a lot of assistance from the research community. So it's the sort of collaboration that I'm really looking to highlight here and to enhance through making these connections with various policy stakeholders coming from different perspectives.
Yeah, it's great to hear that, you know, because it plays into research and the work of universities as well to build a consensus and a collaborative approach to implement action and change in that area. But equally, as we've seen in the media over the last week or so, haven't we, that you know, it's the draft agreement that is now going round and round. It is an agreement that has to be signed by all parties, and so you need this kind of environment that you can have at a COP to build that consensus. Great. And one final follow-up question for you, Wassim, before we move on with other panelists is, we noted that you're also a member of the Commonwealth Futures Climate Research Cohort. Can you briefly explain for the audience what that entails?
Sure. So my membership to this cohort basically aims to accelerate action, for us to work on research action projects that would accelerate action for climate action. My team, for example, are looking at ensuring access of cleaner energy for rural communities and developing countries in the South, in the global South. And through my presence here at COP and my engagement with some of the delegations here, I was able actually to engage specifically with those communities, with organizations that are concerned with these, with this topic in particular, like sustainable energy for all, and there are organizations representing African countries, for example. So it's a great place also to enhance the impact that our team could have through the climate change cohort. And basically our focus is on those most vulnerable populations, and transferring this knowledge from the global north to the global south, to respond to protect the most vulnerable populations, and to afford them with the knowledge base that they lack.
Yeah, that's another great initiative, and thank you for being part of it on behalf of us all. Yeah, well, that's great, Wassim. We will bring you into the panel discussion a little bit later, and so we'll be back with you soon. So what I'd like to do now is welcome our next panelist, who is Fatima Ali. Fatima is the Sustainability Officer for the University of Southampton Students' Union, and she's a final year BSc Geography student. She was at the COP in the first week, last week, and so she's going to offer some reflections from her time there. So just as I bring Fatima in to the stream, here she is. Welcome, Fatima.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and really looking forward to giving some of my reflections on my first week at COP.
Great. So I've put a little few photos that you sent us of your time there last week for the audience to see. And I want to start off with a quick question to you, which is, you took part in COP last week through your Sustainability Officer role at the Students' Union. Can you give us a flavour of what you did and what you saw when you were at COP?
Yeah, so the first week when I went with as part of the Student Union, we were mostly in the green zone. So this was a range of public exhibitions, events, stalls held in the SCE. So that's the centre of where all of COP is going on. And we went to a range of events. So these were a couple hosted by Sky Sports about the link between sports and carbon. We went to another event on hydropower and a range of other really cool climate-related events. So the link between culture, dance, and climate change, as well as a couple of like cool shows and like events and things like that. So it was in general it was really good buzz being in Glasgow. So there was a couple of other fringe events going on as well. Generally everything, like just going through Glasgow by the bus, everything was kind of covered in sustainability, net zero pledges and so on. So yeah, generally really good to be in the centre of it all and the centre of all the buzz.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, tens of thousands of people there, and the protests and things as well. I'm sure it must have been wonderful, and I'm jealous that I couldn't be there myself. So we'll get into the details in the panel discussion shortly, but overall, from your perspective as a young person representing students, did you leave COP feeling more optimistic about climate action than when you arrived?
Yeah, so obviously being at COP and being in the centre of it, talking to lots of people, obviously people who are just as passionate as me, lots of young people, being there, obviously I felt quite inspired, quite this will be the event that will lead to further change. But obviously coming back to COP, and now that we're reaching towards the end of COP, you kind of come back and you think to yourself, well, now what? Now how am I supposed to, as my role as sustainability officer, how do I bring that same momentum and I guess apply to the wider COP? How do we maintain this momentum on our climate change? So feeling optimistic in that everyone seems to be talking about it and there's a lot of attention around it at the moment, but I guess uncertain as well in terms of whether we're going to be able to sustain this.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I'm glad overall there is some optimism. We'll come into both sides of it shortly. And just a really brief final question before we open up to the panel more widely as well. Well, any initial, we'll come on to this later, but any initial key takeaways or reflections that you'd like to share on what you've seen and what happened at the COP? Yeah,
I mean, I guess for me, like, this was my first sort of seeing the first like international climate related event, thinking about the Paris Agreement, which was the last major event that led to like quite a lot of change in climate change. It was definitely interesting seeing such hype around it. So yeah, I think the key takeaway for me is that like young people and seeing there are people that are just as passionate as you. It's a matter of like going out to find them, and I guess really putting yourself out there, and little changes at a time can lead to a big difference. So yeah, COP was quite inspirational, but yeah, we'll have to see in terms of the actual action that governments and organizations will take forward.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a moment. Thanks, Fatima. I'm going to move on now to our next panelist, who is Professor Ian Williams. Ian Williams is Professor of Applied Environmental Science at the University of Southampton, and he has broad expertise in a number of areas, including pollution, sustainability, waste and carbon-related issues, and he's widely published in these areas as well. So Ian, over to you. What are your top takeaways from what's happened in Glasgow so far?
Well, Tony and everybody, I'm very positive about what we've seen in COP26 so far, both what happened before it, during it, and around it. Of course, in the end of October, the G20 met and in Rome, and they agreed to pursue efforts to limit global warming with meaningful and effective actions. And this is important that this happened before the COP, because this group of G20 account for 80% of the world's emissions. During COP, we've had this fantastic, unexpected US-China declaration that's vowed to boost climate cooperation. And these two countries have been at each other's throats for a while. So the fact that they've decided to put aside their differences and work together to address climate change is brilliant. And then, of course, the US and the EU have announced this global partnership to cut emissions of methane by 2030. And this is really using the science, because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And then I think the third thing during the COP that's really impressed me is that leaders from more than 100 countries, which represent, I think, about 85% of the world's forests, have agreed to stop deforestation by 2030. So really important things happening. And then external to the COP, we've seen young people like Fatima being seen and heard and making a difference. And we've seen voices from Africa, Asia, and indigenous communities being heard and making a difference too. So for me, the before, during, and external to the COP messages been very positive, Tony.
Well, that's great to hear, and we will pick up on a lot of those points during the panel discussion. Thanks, Ian. And I'm now going to just bring in our final panel member before we broaden out to the full panel discussion. So welcome to Simon Kemp. Simon is Professorial Fellow in Education for Sustainable Development in the Geography and Environmental Science Department at the university. His research expertise spans education for sustainable development, environmental management systems, carbon footprinting, environmental law, and waste management. And he's also one of the drivers of the university's sustainability strategy. So Simon, welcome. And can you tell us a little bit about what have been the highlights for you so far?
Thank you, Tony. And thank you for the invitation to speak at this wonderful event. I do share some of the optimism that's been spoken about. I was equally thrilled with the commitment about deforestation. That's massively encouraging and positive progress. It's been, I think, one of the most important outcomes from COP so far has been the fact that for the first time ever in any of the UN SCCC declarations, accords, protocols, etc., any of those texts, they've actually mentioned about phasing out coal. Coal has never been mentioned specifically previously. That made it into the draft text and part of the agreements, and also mentioning about cutting fossil fuel subsidies. So that's very positive. I also think that the methane declaration is incredibly powerful. That reduction of 30% below 2020 levels by 2030 for over 100 countries is very positive. But at the same time, it's only a 30% reduction. Admittedly, methane is also very much tied up within the agricultural sector. And it's the agricultural sector that's really worrying me the most with this. I don't see really enough progress being made around agricultural emissions. I'm also a bit concerned, to put it mildly, about the lack of progress that's been made around finance. So much around climate change is tied up with the injustices that have been put upon developing nations, and with them having to try to deal with the impacts from climate change when so much of the emissions to atmosphere have been brought about by the wealthier nations. If we really want to get the whole of the world singing the climate change tune, then we really do need to get finance sorted out. And at the moment, there was talk about having $1 trillion a year go into fund adaptation. by 2030, but at the moment we're still failing to deliver the $100 billion a year, which was promised from 2015 onwards, the original Paris Agreement. I'm a bit alarmed about transport. Transport accounts for approximately 25% of global emissions, but there's only real commitment there has been about the zero emissions commitment, and that was only signed by approximately 30 countries out of the 196 or 197 countries that are there. And that zero emissions vehicle commitment by 2035 or for developing nations 2040 wasn't actually signed by Germany or the United States or China. It's positive there are so many strong words coming out, really positive about understanding and appreciating the fact that the science is there. It's great to see that nobody's actually arguing about the science anymore. It's been accepted. That has never been the case in previous meetings. There's always been that underlying resentment and rejection of some of the science. The science is taken as read now. And those strong words about reductions are very important. But what I would say is that when it comes to strong words, I remember back to the Earth Summit of 1992, there were incredibly strong words there about protecting the environment. And that's where we got the UNFCCC coming out, has led us to this point here. And that was talking about action on climate change. That was nearly 30 years ago. Data showed last year that since 1751, out of all the anthropogenic emissions to atmosphere, more than half of those have actually taken place in that last 30 years. So you're looking at over the 270-year period, in the last 30 years, half of those emissions. And that's that 30-year period in which we've been talking about the action and the science has been clear. So I have reservations and concerns.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that there are definite positives coming through, and it's no surprise, I'm sure, to anyone watching that there are ifs and buts aplenty that still need to be resolved. So without further ado, thank you for that, Simon. I'm now going to open up to the whole panel. So we have Simon, Ian, Fatima and Wassim back in the stream, and we'll keep it like this now and have a wider panel discussion. I will ask those watching to start putting questions in to the chat if you'd like them to be considered, and we'll come to those a little bit later on. I've got a few questions first for the panel, and I just wanted to point out as well at this point that to help us draw out both the positives and the concerns, Ian and Simon are going to kind of split that between them. So it'll probably become apparent in the panel discussion. And forgive the pun here, but one of them is going to be good cop and one is going to be bad cop. Okay, so over to the panel with the first question. I said I'd come back to Greta Thunberg. She dismissed COP26 as a failure last week, and she says that leaders won't bring the change needed and people need to. So is she right? And what's your opinion of the value of things like COP for driving change? So anyone either unmute and start answering that or wave. Okay, Wassim, start us off.
Yes, I can have the first go. Thank you. I think to a large extent, she is right. But so I think, reports during this week, scientific research has shown that the the NDCs that are already in place will not be enough, even if the pledges were acted upon. We're not going to reach the 1.5 degrees by 2030, which is crucial for the survival of our planet. So in that respect, she's absolutely right. And the draft agreement that is being discussed now in the panel a couple of days, that was published early yesterday, comes with a lot of flaws, a lot of ambiguity, and a lot of soft language. And it just seems that the ambition from the Prime Minister of the UK has gone down. We at the beginning of COP there was talk. I'm sorry about the noise. At the beginning of COP there was talk about us beginning to act, focus on how that we need to begin to act, and now we're seeing a sort of a compromise, a position where okay, we're trying to find a way of maybe we're defining success as making country states review their climate plans every year instead of every 5 years. And there's a lot of talk about the technical difficulties that we're facing in terms of securing finance and supporting these developing countries in building their resilience and fighting climate change. There's a lot of skepticism that's around yesterday and today, and there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. I'm sure you've all seen Alok Sharma today speaking that we're running out of time, and even closed the session earlier to go and have all of these bilateral meetings with everybody to try to advance things. And at the same time, you see, there's a lot. You need these world leaders. You need. This is the point where we really need leaders to come in and push everybody forward for these last steps for us to salvage something out of this conference, because it seems like the achievements that are being. I'm a bit more pessimistic, but I feel like these achievements that are being announced, they're just a way to give something. It's just give people something to talk about, for us not to come out empty-handed out of this conference unless something drastic change. I mean, I really applaud the initiatives around phasing out coal and deforestation, etc. But at the same time, and then also there's the announcement about green shipping corridors. But these are all pledges and words, and we really want them to be translated into action. And there's no guarantee that, I mean, in the past there's been a lot of promises made, but that have not been fulfilled. And unless we start seeing actual action, I don't understand. I don't see why we would believe those once more. And I agree that it feels like more just a deferring. We're pushing things a bit further back in time, buying more time, and highlighting these smaller achievements. I think apart from the methane in itself, which have short-term implications on cutting emissions and bringing us forward towards the 2030 objective, all the other achievements are going to depend on, first of all, they're being taken forward by states, and then they're going to take time for them to start producing the effect that we need to see.
Yeah, great. And we will come back to methane in a moment, but over to Ian and then Fatima.
Well, let's remember, folks, that Greta Thunberg is an activist. You know, people like Greta and Vanessa Nakate, these are activists. Their role in this is to criticize leaders, to catalyze action, to embarrass the older generation into getting their asses into gear and making things happen. And they've been very successful in doing this. And just to illustrate, at the beginning of the COP, the most recent analysis from the UN clearly said a rise of 2.17 degrees C by 2100. As a direct result of the COP, if everybody sticks to their pledges, and we have the global methane pledge from everybody who signed it, we've already got limiting down to 1.8 degrees C by 2100. That is a great achievement in just a few days. So Greta has made her point really well, and she needs to keep doing it to embarrass people to take action. So, you know, all power to her elbow, but the COP is having a difference. It really is.
Great. Fatima?
Yeah, I agree with Ian. I was pretty much going to say the same thing, as in that Greta's been really successful in driving that passion and enthusiasm and the anger, I guess, of young people to really, encourage governments and corporations to make change, because change really is going to come from top down, because they're the ones with the biggest impact. And for most of the public, they're not in the blue zone. They're not in Glasgow, so they're looking at it from the outside. So having an event like COP really does highlight things like, you've got up here the climate action tracker. These are things that people might not have paid attention to otherwise. So if there's one thing of COP, I do hope that it's highlighted the urgency of what we need to do and the actions we need to take.
Yeah, great. Okay, Simon, quickly.
Yeah, I think that Greta is right. I don't really feel that it has led to the changes that are required. The 1.8 degree data point is on the most optimistic of scenarios, that everybody sticks to their pledges. No pledges have been kept and maintained by barely any nation in the 30 odd years of global agreements. We had commitments and targets post Paris Agreement, and emissions have risen. We've got nothing to suggest that those optimistic targets are going to be hit. Even if all countries do meet their NDCs by 2030, and they're only 2030 NDCs, then you are looking at optimistically 2.4 degrees Celsius rise in terms of the continued projections for 2100, more likely around about the 2.7. And that's on the current policies. And historically, everybody has failed to deliver on their current policies. I would also like to state that lots of the modelling is fundamentally flawed because it's based on production emissions rather than consumption emissions. So all the reporting that we're putting in the United Kingdom about how we're achieving our targets are actually on, I would argue, on a global scale, incorrect data points. So I feel that Greta's and all of the activists who are saying that it's just a talking shop, unfortunately, history suggests that is the case. And the fact that it's likely to be ending in the next couple of days with a commitment to meet again next year just suggests we're just carrying on kicking the can down the road.
Indeed. Well, you can see who's good cop and who's bad cop now, maybe, but these sides need to be brought out. So what I'd like to do now, panel, is move on to the really broad question that's in the event title, what happened at the COP? But I want to throw in a few specific sub-points that you can hopefully cover. So you could almost say the three key goals from COP26 have been trying to get countries to commit to net zero by 2050. A second one, which is more about substantial near-term actions. And if they don't happen, we won't keep to 1.5 degrees. So this idea of keeping 1.5 alive from the Paris Agreement. And yeah, we'll just cover those two for now. And so, yeah, what have we seen that's going to help with those? What specifics do you want to bring in at this point? Yep, Ian first.
I think the agreement between the US and China, the two biggest emitters in the world, to put aside their differences and to work together to address climate change is definitely a positive in making things happen quickly, because they've already, it seems, had these meetings before the COP, which is why it was unexpected, and they've planned meetings immediately afterwards. So for me, that's a really positive, quick win. And then, of course, I think the methane plan is also very science-based and is going to have a very big impact because of the huge radiative forcing of methane. So for me, those two are real enablers to address keeping 1.5 alive.
Great. Simon?
Yeah, I agree. They are potentially great enablers. However, China didn't sign up to the methane pledge. So that's a massive problem. And the methane pledge is only for a 30% reduction by 2030 based on 2020 levels. I'm also concerned that that agreement between the United States and China is based on a commitment to work together, to set up working groups. That's great, but when one of those main partners isn't signed up for the methane pledge, it's a concern. And when you then add to the fact that both of those countries are not signed up to the phasing out of coal pledge, that's an even bigger concern. The fact that coal has been included in the text is fantastic, but only 23 countries have signed up to that coal pledge, and only five of the top 20 world highest users of coal have signed up to it as well. If we're not immediately eliminating coal, really keeping all reserves in the ground, then I struggle to see how we can do that, because the problem is that all the coal burning has got that longer atmospheric residence time compared to methane, for example. And again, with that methane pledge, it's really talking about leakages from power plants and infrastructure. It's not really addressing methane emissions from agriculture. And that's really the big concern that hasn't been fully tackled at COP. With a growing population, how do we feed that population? What are the difficult choices going to have to be made there?
Yeah, great. And I'm just flashing up this graph. This is from the UN's emission gap report that came out just last week, showing you the purple area third up from the bottom is methane. That's steadily been increasing, as has the main one, fossil CO2, the bottom big chunk of that graph. And the trend obviously is still upwards at the moment, possibly with a blip of 2020, just based on the pandemic. But that really was a blip that didn't affect CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere at all. And so it's definitely an upward trend still. So turning that one around, we're going to need more than small numbers of countries signing up to small percentage reductions. Anyway, Wassim, would you like to give a quick answer?
If I can just, just add one quick point. Some of the bigger polluters in the world haven't committed to a net zero by 2050. I just wanted to raise that point. I mean, examples coming from China or Saudi Arabia, for example, they haven't committed to that so far. This is just the point that I wanted to add. Thank you. Okay,
great. And I want to, you can keep referring to that general question of getting to 1.5 and getting to net zero 2050 through other questions panel. But I wanted to raise a specific one, which is going to be a negative one. Let's look at coal for a moment, the dirtiest of the fossil fuels. The COP26 website states coal is being consigned to history at COP26. But that's just not true, is it? A small number of countries, I think 40 it was, committed to phasing out coal, but China didn't, the US didn't, India didn't, Australia didn't, and even those that did, the timeline wasn't really very short, was it? So, for example, Poland said they will, but not until the 2040s. So this is an announcement that sounds positive on the face, but actually shows a critical lack of sufficient urgency of action. And when we talk about the emissions gap, this is it, isn't it? Simon?
I think the point you make there right at the end about the efficient urgency of action is the critical one here. I'm a little bit exhausted, frankly, of all of these ongoing commitments and promises to do this by 10 years' time, 15 years' time, 30 years' time. It's too long. It's not as if we're not already facing the impacts from climate change already. We've got the evidence here. We know the scientific evidence. The scientific evidence has been around for a couple of centuries as to what happens if you trap carbon dioxide and the associated greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We know what the impacts are going to be. We're already locked into 1.2 degrees. I don't think that it sits compatible with a net zero target for any continuation of coal, and particularly I do have massive concerns with the whole notion of net zero anyway, because so much of that is predicated around technologies that don't exist yet and replanting schemes that are, well, there's going to be biodiversity implications and costs there, but also you've got the negative feedback loops of might be replanting or new plantations, which may not actually be compatible with resistance to wildfires, which will then end up releasing more. And the whole methane commitment is difficult as well, when a lot of the methane which we've got is actually stored up in areas of methane hydrates. We have got whole areas of huge landmass where there is the potential for permafrost to be thawing and releasing from soil in terms of methane to atmosphere, and continuation of coal is just going to exacerbate that.
Thanks, Simon. Over to Ian.
I'm not so negative as Simon on coal. My view is that if you look at the world's population, sort of 2/7 of the world's population is in India and China. And the populations of these countries are not going to sit back between now and 2070 and just allow climate change to happen to them. Because these people are going to stand up and demand change. So what we've seen from the COP26 is countries who have never been involved in addressing coal before starting to get involved. The fact that other countries have signed up has put pressure on India and China, put pressure on Australia. And I think that this is just as an important outcome of COP26 as the actual declarations. So I'm absolutely convinced that, like the British government shifted its plan to phase out fossil fuels from 2040 to 2030 for cars under public pressure, we'll see exactly the same thing happening in India and China as a result of the COP26 for coal. So I'm not as negative as Simon on this. I think it's a good start, and I do think that we will see them pulling their horns in and moving closer towards 2050 on coal, as their populations get more and more active in terms of pressuring them.
Okay, thanks for those points, bringing in some balance. Fatima, what are your views on this one?
Yeah, I'm no expert on coal, but yeah, just thinking about, I guess, the whole argument about developing countries and how much should they be bringing down their emissions, considering, well, us industrialized countries are already much further ahead in terms of technologies. India's pledged to be net zero by 2070, which is even further away than the 2050 targets that we've been focused on. But yeah, I do hope that us as developed nations can lead the way, or share our knowledge, or share technology that we're developing to get towards net zero. So hopefully other developing countries, hopefully they can bring that target a little bit closer, but yeah, we don't know, we'll have to see.
Yeah, and just because Fatima raised that point about India's late commitment, it is worth pointing out we won't have time to cover every aspect of this huge topic in detail tonight, such as equity and justice around the world. But although we've got this net zero target and everyone's fixed on net zero now, we could bear in mind that truly for sustainability, we don't need to get to exactly zero emissions. The Earth can cope with a small amount of emissions, right? The UN has said that if we get to 2 tons per person of carbon footprint by 2030, that's about right to keep us to 1.5 degrees. And India's carbon footprint per person is already less than 2 tons. It's 1.9 at the moment. So you could say that every Indian on average is at the level we all need to be at globally. And it's everyone in the West who has a much higher carbon footprint than the average Indian. Anyway, quick digression there. So that was quite a negative one. I want to just slightly move to a more positive look for a moment. So I went to a recent TED event. TED have been doing a lot of work to support change in this area with their Countdown series, and a lot of speakers. One of them was Christiana Figueres, who did a lot of work for getting the Paris Agreement in where it got to. She's got a small 9-minute talk, I think it is, online, which is all about stubborn optimism and her call for everyone to have stubborn optimism in this challenge. Personally, I've always opted for the term cautious and sometimes very cautious optimism. Panelists, in turn, starting with Wassim, what term would you use and where do you derive your optimism in all of this from?
Okay, I would derive it on every time there's a focus on hope and what can be achieved. And when you look at the initiatives that are already being taken by state actors or non-state actors, industries, any organizations, the louder voice that's being given for women, for the protection for the future generations, indigenous people, the inclusion side of it is really encouraging, and the focus on what can be achieved is also promising. So, but again, I mean, this has to be looked at. I mean, I'm trying to stay as positive as you want me to be now, but it has to be said taken with a grain of salt. But yes, I think there's a lot that can be that industry has shown can be done. It's just waiting for policy to catch up, for regulation to catch up, to make it to make it the norm for everybody to follow. So the first movers are having a great role to play, and we're already seeing that, and that's where I would derive the optimism from.
Yeah, great. Ian, then Simon, then Fatima.
I'm a great fan of saying yes to any initiatives that are put forward to address climate change. Just say yes to them and then work out how you're going to do it afterwards. For me, that's the most positive thing you can do. Say yes, work out how to do it.
Yep, Simon.
In terms of how you define optimism, I'd say that all I have is frustrated optimism. Keep on trying to be optimistic, but keep on getting frustrated by it. I would love to say that I've got optimism in terms of what's coming from public pressure, but I do worry that people don't quite understand the scale of change that's necessary. And I think that I can see a lot of trouble in the next few years about trying to get people to be able to embrace those levels of changes, because I think we've got too used to this particular way of living. I do agree with Ian. I do agree that the best thing to do is to say yes, is to go full steam ahead, no pun intended, on trying to find the solutions and trying to come up with ideas and to make them work. But I think so much of that is around people. At the moment, I'm worried there's too much on the way of false promises, on false hope around false technologies that don't exist yet. It's got to be about people. And if we can't be optimistic and positive around that and saying yes to people and supporting them, then I think that we have got a bit of a problem.
Yeah, great. And Fatima, you know, again, representing the younger people out there, this is your future. What about you in terms of the optimistic side of it?
Yeah, definitely. I think as Wassim kind of touched upon, it is really nice to see the inclusion. So I guess females, people of colour, Indigenous people, having them on the at the front and doing their speeches, that was really quite inspiring to see. But yeah, in terms of optimism, we do need to be empathetic towards ourselves and be optimistic, changing our habits and making those daily transitions, such as not going into fast fashion, reducing our waste, taking public transport. These things are not easy to do, but being optimistic and hoping that these small things will make a change. I think, yeah, optimism is the only thing that's going to motivate us, take us forward. In terms of representation of young people, it's quite funny to see that all these decisions are made in the blue zone, and I don't think there's a young person in sight in that area. So they're all protesting outside. So representation of young people is a question. But yeah, I'm hopeful in terms of we're all quite passionate, and I'm hoping that will take us forward.
Yeah, and it's great that that's really come to the fore over the last couple of years, which has been massively missing before that. And that'll continue to happen, hopefully. Okay, great. We've had loads of questions coming in from those watching the stream. So thank you for those, everyone. And we won't have a chance to get to all of them, but I'll just put one in straight away to start with. This is from Mark. And maybe Simon could kick off with this. You mentioned, Simon, consumption perspective instead of production earlier. So Mark's question is around how there's been a few really massive carbon generating areas missed from the COP. Consumption generally, food and soil. Can you clarify those areas and how maybe the consumption versus production view affects that?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, it's a very good point that Mark makes there in terms of these areas are quite concerning areas of emission. I think that when it comes to something as fundamental as feeding people, then it's very, very difficult to get into that rounds around in terms of politics. So you can put pressure on and make commitments around energy, for example, changing infrastructure. You can do that around transport, although still obviously they're not including aviation as part of the Paris Agreement or any targets here. When it comes to everything around food and soil, well, all of that is around agricultural practices. All of that is around individual choices which drive the production pattern. So it's the consumption there that matters. Why it's not included, who knows? Should there be more done on agriculture? Absolutely. But as I said, the problem is tied up with individual behaviours. So there's got to be that partnership approach with policymakers and public awareness and changing supply chains, and also trying to encourage not just people but actual supermarkets, food providers, local stores, etc., from trying to get local produce, for example, things that got less associated carbon. But then you've got the problem of some food types that are actually produced in the UK out of season, which then has got higher carbon emissions than even if you flew them in from other countries. So this is why I think there's a long way to go. And so much of the text is really about those transition points that can be controlled by government. So I would say that's the issue there. Hopefully soil issue will be improving if we've got the halting of deforestation pledges coming through and the regenerative practices that are going through in areas that are sensitive to the soil types and the biodiversity within an area.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for the clarification, Simon. So Ian, over to you. I'm going to challenge you now with potentially a whole raft of comments from Malcolm, who's watching. So three things I think I'll pull out from what Malcolm has written, and then over to you to respond to. So firstly, about the phasing out of coal and how that's great that it's in there, calling on all parties to accelerate this. However, does it really work when we've got the failure to stop subsidies of extraction of new resources, and we've got a lot of states, we haven't mentioned Saudi Arabia so far tonight, amongst others, still stoking the fires? Second part, you defended China in some ways, but is China really going to change? Is China as a state going to tolerate increasing public pressure, or is that actually changing? And thirdly, this is about participation. We need the whole world to get behind effective and fair climate action. But in the Southampton Climate Action March on Saturday, there was a very small kind of segment of society that took part in that march only, a lot of older people, and a lot of society has little interest. So is that going to be a problem?
Well, it's certainly true that countries like China and Saudi Arabia have managed to resist public pressure in the past, but that was then. It's a completely different world now. Remember, China have got 400 million more people than the whole of the EU put together. And those people are not going to want to live in a world full of heat and lack of water and no crops. You know, they're not going to. And the same is true of Saudi Arabia, who are reaching out to the rest of the world in ways they haven't done before. Okay, it's not perfect, but there's no doubt that they are moving towards responding to public pressures in ways that we have not seen before. And evidence of that, China going to work with America on a bilateral climate change policy. I mean, that is nobody saw that coming, and that is a really huge step. And that's clear evidence that things are changing when it comes to China. Now, on your point about the 600 people, I think, turned up to the event in Southampton, amongst them my son and my wife, I have to say. And the first thing my wife said to me was, it's the same people as I always see. But I think that what you're going to see is a complete change. And that's been driven by young people like Fatima, like Wassim. These people are not going to tolerate the world moving towards 1.8, 2.7 degrees C by the 2100. They're just not. Fatima and Wassim are going to have their time in political power within the next 5 or 10 years. And the same will happen in China and Saudi Arabia. And that will be a game changer. So yes, Malcolm's right. That was then. My view is the world has changed, and we will see a big difference in countries like India, China, and Saudi Arabia by 2030.
Okay, thanks, Ian. We don't have long left, everyone, only a couple of minutes. I think maybe one last question from the audience. This is from Alan, and over to Wassim, this one, I think. We've talked a little bit about energy, in different forms, and we've touched on food, for example, but what about transport emissions in the UK? They're about a third of carbon emissions. Were there any tangible impacts or discussion relating specifically to reduction of transport emissions, Wassim?
Thank you. Actually, Wednesday was Transport Day, and I have a great interest in this topic. And I think there's been, generally, I would say that there's been a declaration that around phasing out diesel cars and vans. That's on the positive side, but then on the negative side, big automotive companies didn't sign up to this declaration, and big governments didn't sign up to this declaration either. But this is just, I just wanted to touch up on that in terms of automotive. But my focus is more on shipping, and I think the initiative, the green shipping corridor that was announced between I think 30 or so states is a great initiative. I think it's promising, but at the same time, they pledge to establish those corridors by 2030, and it will depend on whether or not this will come into effect. But the last point that I want to make, and I agree with Ian on that. I think the big change is going to be driven by consumers, and I think consumers are becoming more and more aware of what needs to be done, and they're going to change the market. And I think transport industries in general have done it in the past, have changed due to the change of markets to respond to the needs of the market, and they have all the capacity to do that without even, to be ahead of the regulation, and then for the regulations to follow. So there's been some discussions, but there's still a lot to be done.
Okay, great. I'm going to have to draw that to a close now, because I want to give every panelist the chance to make individual closing remarks. So if you've got any other burning points, panelists, please wrap them up in there. So I'm just going to remove people from the stream and bring them back in one at a time again at the end. So we're going to now close, and I'm sorry to those who didn't get their questions answered. I will just read one more quickly in case any panel member wants to tackle it in the closing remarks. So this one's from Lily. 2030 targets, are they realistic, or were they overambitious? Will countries really be able to move their industries away from deforestation enough to fully stop it by 2030? Don't think that's achievable. Possibly answer that one, panelists. Just while you get ready and marshal your final thoughts, panelists, the way I feel about this is we've seen some good progress in COP26, and it was really great to see, that forecast of 2.7 degrees warming is what we're currently aiming for, on target for, sorry. And they've reassessed that now based on what's happened over the last year, and specifically during COP. The International Energy Agency recently said 1.8 degrees, the Climate Action Tracker says 2.1, the Emissions Gap Report says 2.2 now. So, it's not there yet, but it's got a lot better. On the negative side, a lot of the progress and that is the change that's needed to get to that currently only 1.8 to 2.1 degrees warming is only pledges. Too much of it is non-binding. And some areas like the phasing out coal commitment have fallen well short of what's needed. We have heard, though, haven't we, from lots of people from the UK government and elsewhere, that we've got the technology now, we've got the knowledge, we've even got the finance if we can unlock it. So the thing that's lacking still is the will to act. There's been some ratcheting up of that over COP26, but there's still a lot more that needs to come. Businesses need to sign up as well, and they are starting to do that. But the final point I wanted to make before I hand over to my panelists is that we can all have the will to cut our own carbon footprint if we want to as well. So I said earlier, if we get down to 2 tonnes each by 2030, that's about what we need. We can already go a long way now to cut our consumerism, move away from the throwaway society, choose lower carbon options for what we eat, how we travel, and how we live in general. So a lot of the things that are needed can be done by you individually as well as national governments. Okay, so over to the panelists in turn now for final remarks. I will first turn to Wassim for closing remarks and to summarise your view on the outcome of COP26 and what kind of change of approach should we see for action to start happening, Wassim.
Thank you, Tony. I think what we need to really be doing is to follow on from the momentum that was created by this rapprochement between the United States and China, and putting the differences on the side and focusing and really realizing that we're in the same boat and that this boat is sinking. So we really need to grow this sense of shared destiny and start working together without putting these political differences aside. And but I just want to take a quick chance to reiterate, to actually reinforce what you're saying. And I think absolutely it will come down finally to individual behaviors. And I think there's I think 62% of eventual reductions of emissions will come down to the personal choices that we make as individuals and the way that we live our lives. So these are, I think, I think everybody has a role to play, and that we should really look at what it is that we can do rather than just curse in the dark.
That's great. Thank you, Wassim. And Fatima, over to you again. From your perspective as a younger person, in some ways, any general closing remarks, but also are the commitments enough and are they urgent enough?
Yeah, well, going on to optimism, I do hope their commitment's enough, but I think the pledges and the commitments all at this point sort of sound the same. We need action, and we ideally need it soon. And the next, say, 3 to 5 years are key to our future. And if young people like me and stand a chance. So yeah, we need action. And going back to Lily's question about deforestation, if there are no loopholes and people actually stick to it, then maybe we will be able to reach the 2030 targets.
That's great. Thank you, Fatima. And Simon, any closing remarks? And in particular, what are your hopes for the final day and the draft deal that people are now talking about?
My hopes are that we have a completely different agreement, frankly. I'm not just playing devil's advocate now or being taken on a negative role. I'm generally disappointed. I'm positive about the deforestation commitment, but if you look at most of the points, in terms of what's happening on coal, I think that's a failure. Oil and gas, that's fail. If you look at this Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance that was announced today, there were 8 countries signed up to it. Even the countries such as United Kingdom, who have got a net zero by 2050 target, didn't sign up to it. No, there's no UK, USA, no Norway. That's a fail. Transport, I don't think any of the measures there are sufficient enough. I think the zero emissions vehicles one is laughably pathetic in terms of the numbers of countries that are signed up, and the lack of manufacturers, particularly in terms of the world's biggest automobile companies. We failed in agriculture, as barely mentioned. Finance, we're not hitting any targets there. We can't expect climate justice without the financial input. I think 2030 targets overall are fundamentally possibly achievable, but history suggests otherwise. And on a minor technical note, but I think it matters, I don't like the fact that the agreement has now changed the targets and reporting against a 2010 baseline for reduction targets, whereas originally it was 1990 baseline reduction targets. That matters because those are much more significant percentage drops in emissions if you're monitoring on a 1990 level rather than a 2010. So that was a subtle change that hasn't really been communicated, but it's a very meaningful change, and it worries me.
Yeah, thanks, Simon, for illuminating all of those concerns that we still need to bear in mind. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. So for the final words, before I close the event, over to our final panelist, Ian. No small feat to try and do this, Ian, and especially in a minute or under, but taking the whole of the title of the event, what happened at the COP and what does it mean for the world?
Look, I think the Conference of the Parties 26 really has delivered a conference for the world to address climate change. To address Lily's point, it's not going to address anything for 2030 because it hasn't addressed the cutting of emissions now. It hasn't addressed active transport and enabling afforestation now. But what it has done is it's made sure that emissions are going to be more expensive to make business and industry take notice. It's made sure that young people and poorer countries are not neglected, that their voices are heard, and that particularly the poorer countries have got money, are going to have money to adapt to climate change. And finally, what we're seeing is countries, politicians taking responsibility for emissions and then trying to be accountable for their agreements and targets. And we haven't seen that since the Montreal Protocol of 1987. So, I think it's been very positive, and I can only look forward to big changes in the next few years.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'm just going to bring everyone back into the panel as I start closing down the event. But the other thing I wanted to do, firstly, thank you very much to all of the speakers for giving us such great insights tonight on this really thorny issue. As I say, we can't cover much of it in 1 hour, but we've certainly done our best. So thank you, speakers. Thanks for everyone who came along tonight and threw in comments and questions and took part in the event. I'm just sharing a QR code now with a short request to everyone watching. This has been part of our Arts and Humanities Festival, and if you snap with your phone camera this QR code, it'll take you back to a short bit of feedback form that you can use to give us some of your thoughts. We'd really appreciate and value you doing that. So thank you very much. And then I'll just slide that on in a couple of seconds to our closing slides. Just again to reiterate, this is part of the Southampton Arts and Humanities Festival that the university lays on every year, and this runs forward now for the next 9 days. There are a series of different events, mostly online, like tonight's one has been, some in person, some online content that you can download and interact with as well. And then close into the very final day, next Saturday, the 20th of November. This is our great Hands-on Humanities Day, suitable for all ages, with lots of free activities and exhibitions and workshops taking place on our Avenue campus in Southampton, if you'd like to come along to that as well. So without further ado, on behalf of all of our panelists, thank you very much for coming along tonight, and good night.